Hello and welcome to week 8 of Introduction to Sociology. And I want to commend some of you working ahead here on chapters 13 and 14 discussions, possibly even on the quizzes and assignments here. But that is for this coming week. I think I might have miscommunicated, answered some questions about the assignment for chapter 13, and people might have gone ahead and maybe you thought that was due last week. But nonetheless, it's great. I do want to, however, ask you that we kind of refrain from moving ahead on the discussions. For some of us that are kind of pacing the class, we've got a lot going on, and we start to see people going ahead, and it's actually a little stress-inducing. So write down your, if you want to do the discussion postings and whatnot, type them out, get them ready, but don't kind of submit them until we're in the week altogether. I think that's probably a better way to do that. So we're going to be looking at chapters 13 and 14. We're going to start with aging and the elderly and then look at the family. And in the hope of making some of these videos a little shorter than they've been, I'm going to go through this rather quickly. So here we are in aging and the elderly. And of course, I teach developmental psych, so there's a lot of crossover between when we look at the developing human being and that developing human being in the context of their social culture. So first and foremost, you get into issues like stereotypes that impact the psychology of someone. In my developmental psych class, I introduced the generations, which is going to come up here, and we introduce the social clock. And here we have this social clock. Now, in developmental psych, we say the social clock is society's expectations for what you should or should not be doing based on your age. And we know there's lots of diversity, but we still have those sort of things. We still have the phrase, act your age, which is a sort of about as best as you can in terms of one sentence that describes the social clock. Now, so what are people at age 15, 27, 35, 87? What are they supposed to be doing at those different ages? And we all know individuals that might have a different clock. We know the 35-year-old person that hasn't left home yet. And we see that. And unless there are other circumstances, the person has a disability or they're staying home with an elderly parent and taking care of them, there are ways in which we excuse from those normal patterns of the human life based on age, but in general, we're all aware of them. Now, they may be very diverse in your family. In your particular family, it might be perfectly normal, and it was years ago for kids to stay longer. In fact, they maybe have stayed long enough to take care of their parents through their passing and stayed in the house. And so for some people, that's the expectation, that maybe the farm, the family business expands the household that way. Maybe building a property on the back. I've seen that all over the place too. You have the main property from the house, and then you have the, kind of split up in some other houses for each one of the kids is out there. Creates a nice little family community, but a different social clock. So we look at that. We look at social clocks both as a guide as to what we're supposed to be doing in our particular age, and as a social guide, what our society tells us we're supposed to be able to do. But it's also a source of stereotypes and discrimination. So we need to keep in mind there's two sides to that particular coin. So aging happens. We have the field of gerontology that talks about all the issues of aging. We have, of course, changing demographics comes up as a sociological topic as well, certainly. For instance, the graying of Maine really points to the notion that individuals, the average age in Maine is going up because young people are leaving the state, and what's left are the people that are aging in place. And so in order to combat that and make sure that there's a vibrant workforce for the work that is here, there's all kinds of efforts going on to kind of slow down the exodus of people leaving Maine, and some programs actually created specifically with that goal in mind. Now, talked about the social clock, the expectations that society has for specific ages. There's also we talk about the generations here, and I talk about the generations in my developmental psych class, but the generations are contextualized in what we call the other clock, one of the other clocks, the historical clock. Now, just as a prequel for maybe you've taken developmental psych, but there's 4 clocks. There's the psychological clock, the developing maturation of the person's mind and thinking capacities. There's the biological clock. You've probably heard of that one. Then there's the social clock, social expectations for different age. And then the historical clock, what we're talking about presently, and that is the notion that based on when you were born, the age in which what was going on in the world at the time that you were born, creates particular predictable personality characteristics to a degree. Now, this is big numbers, so we can't go up to someone and say, hey, you were born in 1965, therefore you are, ... and insert, what we know about that. That's not the application of this. The idea is that these generations, large groups of people, we have the silent generation, these are listed in the course book, silent generation, the baby boomers, you've heard of that, and then you see those Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z. I'm not sure why we ended the alphabet there, maybe we should have had a little forethought. Now we're Generation Alpha, I guess we're going to start the alphabet over again. People born after 2011. And so each of these generations, we can look at the things that were going on in the world during their particular development, maybe when they became aware, what was going on in the silent generation. We had the 2 world wars, World War I and World War II, and the ending, essentially, of the Depression. That created some trends within that group. Then all those soldiers came back. We had the sort of an industrial revolution, and we see work patterns and those kind of things coming out of the baby boomer generation, and kind of a sort of a rejection of traditional values that were in the silent generation to produce the 60s, which not universal, but it's actually a very interesting story. My mom was born in 1945, was a teenager, young adult during the hippie generation, spent her life in northern Maine, never even knew about it. I've asked her about it, what was it like in the 60s? And she's like, never heard of it. It was just, so this idea that this was widespread everywhere, this sort of the 60s vibe, was actually very concentrated in different areas, but a very, very fundamental and powerful movement, similar to the fundamental and powerful movements going on today that are affecting the young people of today when Generation Z, right now, those individuals who are in their early teens up until their 20s right now, those individuals in the heat of BLM, in the heat of climate change, these kinds of things, the Generation Z is going to have some unique characteristics to it. So we see those as the larger world order, the larger world circumstances impacting the way we think. And certainly we can take that, say I was a Generation X, and we were very stuff-oriented, just as a group. And I can relate to that. I can relate to having the gadgets. We had the Walkmans, and then we had, the first computers that came out. We had our bikes, and we had our walkie-talkies, and we had all of these stereo systems and stuff. But consumerism, kind of personal stuff, having personal possessions, a part of that age. And compare that to, let's say, the silent generation growing up in the Depression. Wow, there'd be such a gap. And that's where we get that term, generation gap. We to look at these generations. It can happen within a family. Look at the generations regardless of this structure. But we can see difference in the values, norms, and expectations, the culture that's based on the age in which you were born. So just some really, really interesting stuff. This exists throughout the world, but they might be based on different social events, and they might happen at different times because different things were going on in those parts of the world. Now, I'm going to reverse back here to this social clock, and we're going to look at the expectations that are out there and for the elderly. But we're going to take the dark look and look at some of the negative aspects of that, ageism. In the medical community, assuming that things like losing your memory and losing capacity are normal aspects of aging, which there are not. So when somebody's having an Alzheimer's moment, that is not necessarily normal. Alzheimer's is certainly not normal, and it's not something to be kidding around with either. the elder abuse, the perceptions of the elderly as weak and rocking in the rocking chairs and spending their time in long-term care facilities, and all sorts of abuse stories that when I was a social worker, some horrendous situations of families taking advantage of their elderly folks, and some pretty sad cases when this highly vulnerable population that is worthy of our attention. Now, as we move into the work for this chapter, we have a discussion, and that is for you to talk about your generation as it's described in the textbook. You may or may not fit that. There's lots of diversity within. You may be an old soul, and you're like, I'm a lot like the silent generation, or I'm a baby boomer, I'm a new age hippie, and you're your own person, and all of those expressions are totally valid, but let's look at them through the lens of those generations and see if you can recognize any of yourselves in that. And then talk to your families, talk to your grandparents if they're around, and your parents, and talk to people that you know about their values and and just kind of recognize that as things change, it leaves the imprint on people. So we'll be sharing some of those stories in this. The assignment, however, really probably should be a special assignment. It is so outside of the regular thing here. And that is, it's the assignment, and it's hidden in the discussions, because I'm not actually having you submit the work. That is private, and I do not need to know the results of this work. But what I'm asking you to do in Chapter 13 assignment, and I recognize I might have to do some finagling around in the class to make sure that all the pieces are in the right place. But Chapter 13 assignment, you will find in the discussions area, if you're using that top menu in Brightspace. But what it has you do is engage in some financial planning. You use some online tools to determine where you are in terms of your retirement planning right now, and what it's going to look like when you are approaching, when you retire, when you pick the age when you're going to retire, when you would like to retire, when you need to retire, and what does that look like? How far is the money going to go? And this is a really kind of cool opportunity. I do this in my face-to-face classes. People, again, keep it private. A couple people, raise their hand and put it up there. Many of you might not have any financial planning going on at all right now. You might think that it's too far away, and I'm going to really encourage you that engaging in some of this is a really good idea. We talk about that Social Security is still solvent, and with all the rhetoric that's going on, if you actually go and look at the numbers, we're okay, but you never know. You never know. And having your own nest egg is probably a good idea. And if you start that early, it's incredibly easy to see great wealth come from that. So that's a really kind of cool opportunity to engage in that sort of project. Remember, that's in the discussions. You'll find and I just want you to talk about it. You don't have to reveal all the details or anything like that. Just go into what you might have discovered. Next, we talk in Chapter 14, we're talking here about marriage and family. And for many people, this is a very, very important part of their growing up, their sense of identity, who they are as a person, and kind of a basic structure of where sociology kicks in. This kind of, when we talk about the different groups we belong to, and that each one of these groups has its unique culture, norms, values, expectations, and material culture. Family rises right to the top. It's the first one that we experience, and it's the one that very likely, good or bad, has the widest influence on us. In fact, when we talk about socialization earlier in the text, and we talk about the transmission of culture from one generation to the next, that is essentially what we call the manifest function, or the principal function of family, is to give you the skills that you need in order to survive in the world. Now, when we take that functionalist perspective, which is really where that manifest function is sort of that functionalist perspective, and we take a look at that in light of the term that we have available to us that you've probably heard, which is the dysfunctional family. Now, the dysfunctional family, from the point of view of some of, the origins of some of those words, come from the field of substance abuse, where we see the functioning of a family has modified statuses and roles for people in the family that support the abuser. For example, if there's a parent who's an alcoholic, then often they're a dependent, and you might have heard the term codependent. And then the children or the other members of the family also play a role. And in that classic model that was put forth as the the roles that people take this in a dysfunctional family, supporting alcoholism against the drinking, but supporting it in order to maintain the structure of the family. If you do that work, you're going to have the codependent. You have the hero part of the family, whoever that is, the person that is the symbol of the good of the family. You have the scapegoat, it's the person who's blamed for the trouble of the family, and then you might even have one or two kids that are sort of hidden. They're sort of backed away, they're sort of disengaged. And we see these patterns in the dysfunctional family when we're talking about treating something like substance abuse in the context of an entire family. And we can also use that term dysfunctional family to describe any family that is failing to do any of those functions. And if you look in the course book, you'll see under the theoretical perspectives of the family, we see that families provide stability, that families define status and roles, and not only currently but in the future in terms of manifesting ambition and whatnot, educational support, socialization, like I said, and economic support. What if a family is not able to do that? Look at today. We have COVID-19 that may have taken some people out of work, and it threatens a basic function of the family, providing economic support for their kids, for the family structure. And so sometimes external factors can come in, excuse me, and sometimes internal factors like a disease or a problem, not necessarily substance abuse. If somebody develops cancer and they're no longer able to work, and that it really challenges the family to be able to adapt. And certainly, just like we see in that sort of negative scenario of a substance abuser and how that affects the family, you also see family changing gear when tragedy strikes or when challenges strike. Somebody loses their job for whatever reason, and how people shift in order to support the family. So we see a different use of the word dysfunctional. And then as we make our way through the different perspectives here, we look at the conflict perspective and, what are the values that are being taught? Different families have different values. Some might have high work ethic, might have low work ethic. You might have child rearing practices that are different between families, and we see that these can sometimes be conflictual. What's being taught in the school is the representation of the culture that is being accepted in the wider world versus what's being taught in the household. Those kinds of conflicts that can occur. The third perspective, the symbolic interactionist one, is one where we see the meaning of family. And we can throw in there who family is. Now, maybe you had a great family, and maybe you get together every Thanksgiving, and maybe you have events in your life that's very, very core, and that's awesome, and you have a very, very deep sense of connection to those people that are your family. And others may not have that. They may have their family may be passed away. They came from a very small family. They're distanced away, and their family's a little bit closer. Or maybe their family's a whole other group of people. Maybe they've left that dysfunctional family and found another one and got ingrained in that one and created their family. But it's the meaning that is to you. It's part of who I am. It's one of those, it would be on the short list of your describing yourself. When you say, as I describe myself, I can be individual, but it's not long before I start saying, well, I have these other statuses in my life. I'm a father, I'm a husband, those kinds of things that I would throw in there that are inclusive to my identity, that are related directly to family. And then finally, in the postmodern perspective, we look at the impact of technology on the family. And that's going to be where one of our assignments goes, where we look at media and communication and all that. So let's just jump into the two discussions we have for this chapter. The first discussion is to talk about your family values. and to express those. What did you grow up with? What did you keep? What did you set aside? How important it is, all those kinds of things. And I want you to kind of, when you're thinking about norms, values, and expectations, I want you to think about the processes in your family where that was actually taught. And let's say you have a very close family that expresses gratitude to one another, and so you have a tradition in your family that you get together for Thanksgiving coming right up here, and you express those out loud. That was a significant event in your life when those things are there. Now, I'm going to give you an example to kind of blow open the doors on this. You don't have to stick to holidays. You don't have to stick to anything. But there was one semester I had this discussion, and one person posted a very, very touching and elegant story about a event that happens in their family for every child, male and female, when they turn 11. Don't know why it's 11, but nonetheless, it's 11. And in that family, everybody that turns 11, there's a big event that occurs. Everybody's invited. There's a big meal and whatnot. And the 11-year-old is presented with their first gun. Now, that individual lives in a family. The person who posted this lives in a family where hunting is a great tradition. And getting your first rifle meant that you were now old enough to join that tradition. And this person related how important that was to them, how important they would see the older kids, going out on the hunt. And they wanted to be a part of that. And that event was a very, very big place that talked about the value of self-sustenance through hunting, the value of guns, little Second Amendment stuff in there. It taught very important values to generation to generation. And he said everybody would show up. It was like the biggest event of the year when somebody turned 11. So I thought that, so share those stories. It'd be neat to see the diversity of how these values are taught. The next one, I want you to do some reflection and some possible research as to the impact of technology. And we often see, say mobile technology, we see, as I did in the little cartoon, everybody's standing around the table and they're all texting. Maybe they're texting each other even. I've actually been in a room that was doing that. Instead of talking, they were texting. Now, that aside, we often see that as sort of a negative aspect of technology. It sort of put us into a bubble and keeps us from interacting with people around us. Yet at the same time, I'll give you a personal example. Right now, you might see my hands going around, but I haven't really talked about this blue band here that I have. And this blue band says Team Wendy on it. Now, Wendy is my ex. She's the mother of my children. We have a very close relationship. I'm thankful that I met her because I have two great kids about it. Now, Wendy is battling cancer right now. And she also lives in Arizona. And so my kids who live in Maine, thankfully, for the gift of technology, they're able to reach out to her and have this face-to-face with her, even though she's very far away. And it allows us to communicate. We, coordinated the design of these things. We share stories. There's an ongoing online discussion about, updates. How you doing today? How'd the tests go? Talking about, everything else that's not cancer. And just technology has been key in helping the entire family structure cope with this challenge, and has certainly supported Wendy in her personal battle, being quite far from most of her family. So you can see technology has both those positive and negative effects. Like all technology, it's the utilization of it, right, that determines whether it's good and bad. So let's share some stories and some insight and maybe even some research. Go in there. There's actually some very interesting aspects of technology about how we're writing more than any generation and we're communicating more with our families than any generation before. Some interesting aspects to that have actually drawn families closer together, while at the same time technology has also provided for some barriers for people to communicate. So let's enjoy those discussions. Looking forward to hearing some great stories from you, and I will see you in those discussion boards.